I'm David Scott. I'm one of the deputy managing editors at the Associated Press, and I'm glad to be with you all today. Joined by Christina Cassidy, who's one of the reporters at AP who focuses on voter integrity and the process of conducting elections in the United States. And so today what we want to talk to you about a little bit is counting the vote. We're going to talk at the top about how AP counts the vote, and then really I'll turn things over to Christina to talk about sort of the state of voting in the United States and how state officials and county officials and election officials are getting ready for this year's election, a most unique one. So AP plays a pretty unique role in our democracy. We founded a cooperative in 1846, and 2 years later, we were not content to wait around for the vote count to happen. And of course, there is no way, there's no outline in the Constitution about how America should tally up its votes. So we stepped into that void in 1848. In that first election, we counted up the 2.8 million votes cast in 30 states. Zachary Taylor won that election. And it took us more than a few hours to do that. And it often takes us more than a few hours to do that. Counting up the vote in all the elections that we tabulate down the ballot often takes several weeks in the case of a general election. And that's just the way that it's always been, and it will likely be the way it is this year as well. This year, about 130 million Americans are going to vote in the presidential election. For the first time in history, we think more than half will do so before polls open on Election Day. It's a pretty amazing transition that's going to take place this year. That shift has been taking place over time. In 1972, 95% of Americans, when Richard Nixon was reelected, voted in person at a polling place on Election Day. In the last general election in 2016 and in 2018, about 42% of Americans voted in advance. And like I said, this year that number should be well over 50% and could be as much as 60 or 65%. We'll see once Election Day arrives. Advance voting is new in some places, but it's not new in the United States by any measure. And we've been that trusted and independent source for the vote count for a century and a half, free of any type of political influence or government influence. We have a lot of expertise doing this. Our team, we have a dedicated team of election researchers who aren't doing this on the side. They're not political reporters who also do elections research or also focus on the vote count. We have a whole team that is focused just on this effort full-time, not just in an election year, but all the time, about pulling together all the information that we need to count the vote successfully. We do testing of our systems and testings and practices for how we will run election night more or less constantly, especially as we approach the night of a general election. And how does it all work? Well, it's the biggest act of journalism. It's 4,000 names on the byline title. It's really that big of an effort. The more journalists involved in this story than really anything else. We have reporters and stringers at more than 4,000 locations nationwide. And that's just one of the ways that we count up the vote or collect the vote at the local level. In some places, it's as complicated as notes on a whiteboard put on a picture posted to Facebook. And in other places, it's very sophisticated reporting systems. But we take in all the vote from wherever it is and however it might be reported into one of our vote entry centers, and that goes into our secure election system. We do a tremendous amount of checks for accuracy and anomalies along the way. We're looking for things that don't make sense, and we catch mistakes made by ourselves, but also often made by election officials that we point out to them. And then when we're sure about the vote totals being correct, we publish them around the world. The pandemic has had some impact on what we do. We adjusted early in March, and we've run since then dozens of presidential primaries and state primaries, all tabulated successfully, even as we were working remotely. Our virtual operations are well tested. We've spent the year essentially getting ready for the GE and have had lots of experience now working in a pandemic and being able to do our work counting up the votes successfully, even in these difficult times. A big focus this year, obviously, is the boom in advance vote. Christina will talk a lot about that, but we spend a lot of time right now looking at where that's taking place, doing the research, involved so that we can report out and tabulate that vote accurately on election night. One of the big things that we're looking at and have the details on for every state is when can they start processing ballots and when can they start counting them. I know Christina's going to talk a lot about that as well, and the importance of that on election day and the days thereafter. Another thing that we spend a lot of time looking at is who's setting the rules. State officials, lawmakers, state and federal courts, over the last, 96 hours now, that we've seen the rules around what's going to take place in terms of when ballots can be received in Wisconsin go back and forth. Federal district court, an appellate court, the same appellate court, sort of kicked it around like a tennis ball about what the rules are going to be. And we're tracking all of that in real time so that we know and are ready for however the states and local officials conduct their elections. So to get more into that about how things are going and how we expect the vote count to play out before things get to the point where AP starts tabulating the vote, I'm going to turn it over to one of our voting reporters, Christina Cassidy.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I will be focusing on state and local readiness for the November 3rd presidential election. So let's begin with a question. Will this be an unprecedented election? In some ways, yes, but in other ways, well, as you see here, elections are always messy. For anyone who has ever covered an election, you know that something inevitably goes wrong at your local election office. We have some 10,000 voting jurisdictions in this country that are charged with administering elections. That means 10,000 places where something can and will go wrong. But elections are largely resilient. In most places, you have election officials who've been running elections for years under procedures that are largely defined and well-honed. Sadly, long lines are nothing new, particularly in urban and poor areas. And that's not to say that that is at all acceptable, but it's a fact, and it's been a fact before 2020 and COVID-19. Certainly, poll closures as a result of the pandemic have contributed to this, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But it's important to keep in mind that poll workers make mistakes, voting equipment breaks down, and that's not necessarily a sign of Russian interference, a complete meltdown in the system, or evidence of widespread voter fraud. We can talk about ways we can sort through all of that in a little bit. Also, bad actors peddling misinformation is not new. Robocalls telling Democrats to vote on Wednesday and Republicans to vote next week happen in just about every election. But now we have social media to contend with and the rapid fire proliferation of false information. The good news is that there are safeguards built into the system and all of us are positioned to be guardians of truth. So let's talk about COVID-19. On the next slide, as we all know, we expect more absentee ballots than ever before to be cast in a presidential election. Election officials are facing a real challenge in essentially running two elections, one by mail and one in person. This is creating an extraordinary burden on local election officials in particular, in places unaccustomed to high volumes of absentee ballots. It's impossible to predict who's going to vote at home, who's going to vote early if that is available, and who's going to wait until election day, because in many cases, voters haven't decided this for themselves yet. Then we have the prospect of mail delivery delays, last-minute poll worker cancellations that would trigger polling place closures. There's also the very real possibility that a COVID outbreak could shut down an election office in the middle of early voting or just days before an election. And this isn't even getting into non-COVID related scenarios like a DDoS or ransomware attack. So how prepared are election officials to deal with this? Here are the pressure points we have to pay attention to. Absentee ballot deadlines and postmarks. What are the rules in key states? How long do election clerks have to wait to process absentee ballots? What are the rules for rejecting ballots and conducting ballot reviews? There will undoubtedly be delays in reporting results. So what does this all mean? So let's start tackling this one by one. So first, when are ballots due? On the next slide, we talk about in most states, they have to be back by poll close on election day. This includes states like Arizona and Florida. Some states allow ballots to be received back at an election office as long as the ballot is postmarked. You'll see here that the window varies across states. Georgia's currently 3 days, although that's being appealed by the state. Wisconsin just yesterday, a court affirmed 6 days. So what about this postmark rule? States that allow for ballots to arrive after Election Day require a postmark to indicate it was dropped off by Election Day and not after. No one wants people casting ballots after Election Day, so the postmark is an important safeguard. But postmarks can also be problematic. Not all mail gets a postmark. Sometimes a mistake is made, or the postmark is illegible. To address this, a few states, the ones who've been doing all mail for years and more populous states, have embraced something called intelligent mail barcodes. This is like tracking your ballot like an Amazon package and allows for both election officials and voters through the use of a ballot tracking system to know exactly where a ballot is in the process, when it was dropped off, when it arrives at an election office. So these ballot tracking systems also can alert voters if their ballots have some problem that needs to be fixed, or else it will be rejected. In Denver, voters can even fix these problems on their smartphone. But this is the exception, and most places this is not yet available. So let's talk about the process for verifying ballots. This is a major area where election officials can hit snags and voters can run into problems. First off, most states allow local election officials to do some level of processing of ballots ahead of time. And an important reminder is that this verification process is critical to ensuring that a ballot has been lawfully cast. It's a big reason why voter fraud is rare, and when it does happen, people are caught and prosecuted. So what does this involve? It can mean different things in each state. Some states allow some of this work to be done, but stop short of actually opening the envelope itself and getting to the ballot. But in general, it means examining the outer envelope, confirming a voter's eligibility against the voter registration database, ensuring that this voter had in fact requested a ballot and is not listed as deceased, that the envelope's signed. In some states, this involves matching the signature against signatures the election office has on file. For states that do more extensive processing, it's opening the ballot, making sure it hasn't been damaged in some way, setting it aside if it is, examining the ballot to ensure that it's a legal ballot. So a quick aside, there's no credible way that a foreign government would be able to print fake ballots and somehow be able to match cardstock, contain all the identifying information, get the long list of races accurately down to the precinct. It's not a legitimate claim. So again, in most states, this happens either upon receipt of the ballot or at a certain number of days ahead of the election, set by law or administrative rule. And the important thing to keep in mind is that this all takes time. And for those states that are used to less than 10% or even 25% of ballots being cast absentee, this is an enormous increase in work for local election officials. As a result, they are hiring temporary workers to help, which can pose its own problems. See the recent incident in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, which made all sorts of headlines as a prime example. And speaking of Pennsylvania, it, along with Michigan, doesn't allow election clerks to begin any of this work until the very last minute, meaning delays are inevitable. So let's talk briefly about ballot rejections and ballot reviews. As mentioned, many states use signature verification to validate a mail ballot. This involves matching a signature on a ballot to a signature or signatures on file. Again, states that have been doing mail voting for a while now are more likely to be more aggressive about keeping signatures over time, so they have a more thorough record of signatures to compare against. What you should know is that there are numerous problems that can be associated with this. Even election officials will acknowledge this is not an ideal system. Key issues are training, having that good catalog of signatures that can capture changes over time, but also tells that provide some consistency, things like a slant or a certain way of crossing T's and dotting I's. Also, think about all those awful signature pads at the DMV. What you sign there is likely what's being used to compare your signature against. So the technology isn't a great help either. So a few states require a witness or notary signature. Some have waived this due to the pandemic, and others are subject to litigation with last-minute changes and confusion likely. See South Carolina recently. Per NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, just 18 states require voters to be notified when there is a missing signature or a signature discrepancy. This number is also changing due to litigation. Courts have been inclined to uphold the signature matching requirement, but ordering officials to implement a clear process for voters to be notified and provided a reasonable opportunity to fix these problems. There are also ballot reviews that happen when voters don't follow instructions and poorly mark their ballots. I just wrote a story about this over the weekend. I know I'm running short on time, but I can talk about this more in the Q&A if you like. So what does this all mean for reporting results? Absolutely 100% expect problems to happen on election day. Expect delays in processing and counting this massive surge in absentee ballots. Understand the process, understand the universe of outstanding votes. One thing we haven't talked about that I will also be paying close attention to are provisional ballots. We can talk more about those during the Q&A if you like. And know this, hostile nations and others interested in undermining democracy or seeking to influence the outcome will be looking to this window of uncertainty as we wait for results. We can be the guardians of truth in all of this, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, folks. Really appreciate the presentation. Like we said before, if there's any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But to get us started, I will begin with a question from Andrew. So Andrew's curious, what aspects of the voting process are working well, and how can reporters build trust in our election system? So kind of almost like a solutions perspective to all of this.
Christina, you want to take that?
Sure. So what is working well? I think, at this point, I would focus on the process that we're in right now, ballots going out. So, I would talk to election officials about, the influx of ballot requests, how they're processing these application requests, how the ballots are going out, how the ballots are coming in. Looking at North Carolina, they have a wealth of information on their website about, absentee ballots that are coming in, the ones that are being accepted, the ones that are running into problems. And you can see that the ones that are running into problems represent, a relatively, small share of the vote totals. So those are some of the things that I would, pay attention to and ask about.
Great, thank you. I think Emma had a question. How do you weigh the need to cover pressure points with the risk of certain people using that coverage as so-called evidence to undermine the legitimacy of the election?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that, look, transparency, explanatory reporting, context, completeness is really the answer to that question. And Christina made a really good point about voter fraud and election fraud, and the details about how ballots are secured. Just saying that it doesn't happen. Show don't tell. Get into the details. Talk to your election officials about steps that they're taking. Understand the ways that security measures that are being taken place. Look at what's being done, and do a lot of explanatory reporting. I mean, for those of you who were on the call last week, I was asked, what's the best way to sort of combat this issue? And I think a lot of solid explanatory journalism between now and election day, a lot of context and a lot of transparency about what's taking place is the best way to tackle that problem.
Great, thank you. Along those lines, I had a question about what common misconceptions you guys have seen, either on the part of the press or the public, about how the vote is counted, and how have those misconceptions changed or been more dramatic as a result of everything happening this year? So what should we dive into as far as that explanatory reporting that you're describing?
Well, I'm going to tee up Christina here, but I think the number one misconception that I see is that this is all new. Because it's not new. There were a number of states, 5 as we came into this year, that plan to conduct their elections all by mail. And In-person absentee voting is not new. It's been done for a while. Early voting is not new. It's been done for a while. Processing ballots before election day is not new. It's been done for a while. What is new is the scale. And that's where, so I think that the misconception is what are the problems that we're potentially facing? And it's that, new things are being done in places that they haven't been done before, but nothing's completely new. And as Christina illustrated, it's the scale, right? A state that may have had 10% advance vote before may have, 30 or 40% this time around. Christina, do you want to jump in on that as well?
Absolutely, 100% what you said. The only thing that I would also add is just sort of what I touched on at the very beginning, this idea that elections are messy. And I think we're in such an environment right now where there's just so much anxiety, it seems, from talking to voters, just about trying to figure out how to vote and when to vote. And also, this idea of, long lines and, problems. It's just really sort of making sure that people understand, that things like an equipment failure, things like, a long line isn't necessarily, sign of some sort of systemic, breakdown in the system. It could be isolated. And while that is, not acceptable, that, all election administrators would tell you that they want to run, as smooth an election as possible, but things are going to come up. And, that's why they have plans upon plans upon plans, to ensure that, the election continues to run smoothly.
Christina's point, I think, is super important, right? If things don't go perfectly, the first conclusion shouldn't be fraud or malfeasance or the Russians, right? I mean, we want to do reporting. We want to go out and try to figure out what's taking place. But, we need to do that reporting and not leap to the worst case scenario right from the beginning.
Absolutely. So to tie it back, well, so we did cover how the AP calls elections on election night in an event last week, but someone in the chat was asking about this. And so I just want to give like a elevator pitch or of how that works. If you don't mind, David, just explaining that, how the counting and the vote ties into calling the elections.
Absolutely. So we use a lot of data points when we call elections. And at AP, we don't do projections. We don't say someone's a likely winner. When we declare a winner, that's it. They've won the race. And what we're looking for as our standard is that there's no conceivable way that the trailing candidates can catch the leader. So we use a lot of different data points in that analysis. The number one is obviously the vote count. They're part and parcel of each other. We could not do the work that we do on the decision desk without a really high quality vote count. And it's more than just the totals. It's the types of ballots that have been counted. It's the mode in which they were cast. It's the location from which those ballots have been cast. It's the time that those ballots were cast. And interestingly, over the last few years, it's the time in which those ballots were counted also can play an impact on the trends that we see in the vote count that all lead us to, to sort of conclude when a race is over and it's ready to be called. So this goes back a little bit to the point I was making earlier, like getting ready to do this year. There's really nothing new, but it's applying these sort of types of analysis and looking at these details just in more places. In past elections, the difference in when a vote is counted and how that plays into the trend was not something that was relevant in more than a handful of states. And we expect it to be relevant in a lot more states this year. So it's just more care, more caution, more analysis, more data, looking at it in more ways to make sure that when we make our call that we're confident in them. Again, it's nothing new. It's just a bigger scale this year. And that change in scale was always coming. The trends over time to more advanced voting has been inexorable for the past few decades. And what we're just seeing with the pandemic is just a huge acceleration of it. Like we're just skipping 20 years of this trend and going from 40% advance voting to maybe 50 or 60% in one election cycle.
Related to that question of context or kind of an evolving system, how is the AP planning to frame that traditional like percent of precincts reporting, and that this only includes votes cast that day, not the absentee ballots processed? Is there anything you're changing in that language or framing?
Yeah, it's a really solid question. And this is, I think I used this joke last week. Hamilton was a jerk, right? Federalism isn't fun for vote counting because it allows every state to do it a little differently. And so there's no consistency across the states. And so in some states, precincts reporting, literally the percentage of precincts that have told us what their totals are, remains a really good and accurate way to understand an estimate, get an approximation of how much of the vote has been counted. In other states, because of the way that they count advance votes, i.e. they count them separately from the same day votes, or because they maybe do some other things in terms of when they process ballots, precincts reporting isn't a very good indication. So for example, a precinct might report 4 or 5 times, but that first report, they're now in the reporting category, even though they're going to update us later with a lot more vote. So what we've done in those places is we do an estimate. We call it internally proportional precincts, but we try to use an estimate based on all the information that we have available to us to sort of calculate an estimate of what the actual vote is that's been counted. And at the statewide level, we do that for all statewide races. So the races for president, senate, and governor, we do an expected vote. And again, it's the same thing. It's an estimate based on a lot of various data points that we can refine over the course of the night as the vote count continues and builds, gets more accurate. But we're trying to provide that estimate of what the outstanding vote is and how much is left to be counted. The thing about the decision desk and the vote count team is if we knew what turnout exactly was going to be ahead of time, our jobs would be a lot easier. If we knew the denominator, I could call races a lot quicker than in our system where we just sort of have to wait a little bit and let our estimates get more refined as we count more vote. And that's why you don't see anyone making early calls with closely contested elections, right? You have to wait for more data. If a race is a point or two, but only 10% of the vote is in, no decision desk is going to even go near making a race call because we just need more information. And so we wait.
Great, thank you. And on that note of estimates, and I wanted to give Christina a moment to speak to provisional ballots. Are we going to see more provisional ballots this year, and what impact will that have on the reporting results and those estimates that you guys are calculating?
I can speak to the first part, and then I'll turn it over to David in terms of how that's going to factor into the vote count. But yes, I do. And I think that's because there is a lot, it seems like a lot of voter angst about the method of voting. And so I could foresee circumstances where individuals will request absentee ballots and then change their mind. And show up in person, or perhaps they requested their ballot so late that they didn't receive it in time. And so you are going to have situations of people who are listed in the system as having requested an absentee ballot. And in some states, you must, if you show up in person to vote, vote a provisional ballot so that that can be sorted out at the back end. And there are implications for vote counting in the sense that provisional ballots are always counted last. So they'll go through all of the in-person voting, they'll do the absentee ballots and all of that, and then they'll look at the provisional ballots at the very end. And in prior years, these were mostly issues related to addresses, photo ID that would trigger sort of the provisional, process if you showed up at the wrong precinct, et cetera, et cetera. But this year, because of all of the changes and the concerns around COVID, and then, all these other factors that have also surfaced, I think we're going to see more people, showing up and having to cast provisional ballots because of this.
Yeah, Christina makes a really good point about the increase there. Here's how we think about provisional ballots. She's right in that they're typically counted last. And so on the decision desk, it becomes a pretty quick calculation. A candidate has a lead of 100,000 votes. There are 50,000 provisionals to be counted. We can call that race. There's literally not enough votes left to be counted to make a difference. In 2004, we weren't able to call George Bush reelected over John Kerry until the next day, primarily because we had to get an assessment of how many provisional ballots, not primarily, but directly. This was the decision. We needed to know how many provisional ballots were outstanding in Ohio. Bush had a lead, but we needed to know if there were enough provisional ballots that John Kerry could catch up. And that was a reporting effort. It started in sort of the middle of the night, and it continued right up until about 11 o'clock on the Wednesday after Election Day. And when our reporting, we were able to figure out that there weren't enough provisionals left to be counted to allow Kerry to catch up to Bush, we could call Ohio for Bush, and then he was the next president. And that's the sort of the same type of reporting that we would do on the decision desk and with our vote count team around provisionals. And if the case, there's a lead is 50,000 votes, but there's 200,000 provisionals to be counted, well, then we got to wait, and we got to wait for those provisionals to be counted and before we can call a race.
Great, thank you. Which makes me think of, or Christina's comment makes me think a little bit about that angst, or what she said about angst, especially along partisan lines. So as a follow-up to a previous question, do you guys take some of that into account? And what I mean is, will this take into account data about Democrats voting absentee significantly more than Republicans, or is that not factored into your kind of estimates or predictions about what will happen?
No, this is one of the key questions that we're looking at on the decision desk, right? You're trying to eliminate uncertainty. You're looking for patterns. And you're looking for things that you can count on. And so, that's absolutely something that we're looking at. Here's a good example. In California, we actually made a mistake in 2018. This is something we had rarely seen before, was the amount of vote or the vote counted after Election Day was very different than the vote counted on Election Day. It was a partisan difference, and by like 20 or 30 points. And so we made a bad race call because we expected the vote that was counted after Election Day to fit that same pattern. It was a real object lesson for us, that was one of the new things that we needed to consider, when a vote was counted, as opposed to, or in addition to, when a vote was cast and the type of mode that it was cast in and the location that it was cast in. So we look at all of those things in detail. And if any of them suggest uncertainty, then the trailing candidate has a potential path to catch up. And that means that race is not ready to be called.
Great, thank you. And hypothetically, if a candidate tries to call the election before the final vote count, seeing as not all states will probably be able to finish their vote counts by election night, how should that be responsibly covered to not give legitimacy to the candidate's claims and not stoke further anxiety or angst before the final result comes through?
Yeah, another really good question. I'm going to go back to 2018 as an example of why we should all be careful about early claims of victory and concessions. Andrew Gillum was running for governor in Florida, and he conceded. And then the vote count got a lot tighter and it looked like it was going to go to recount in Florida, and he took that concession back. And candidates could do that, right? Like you can claim victory, or you can concede, and then you can take your concession back, right? So use context, use the facts, report what is taking place. If a candidate declares victory, but AP hasn't called the race and it's still tight, you want to include that information in your coverage. If a candidate concedes, but it could go to a recount, you want to include that information in your coverage. You want to ask those questions of a candidate, right? You're conceding, but does that mean you're definitely not going to ask for a recount? In some states, it's the option of the candidate. So that additional reporting, that additional information is essential on these types of things. I know we're focused a little bit on a candidate declaring victory, but it can happen on the concession side as well. And so what's the state of the race? Has it been called by AP or one of the networks? What are the recount laws in that state? How closely is it contested? Where does the vote count stand? How many ballots are still left to be counted? All of that information needs to be reported along with what the candidate says and does.
And just to add to that, just to underscore, I think you just ask yourself the question about what is the story? Is the story that a candidate is conceding or declaring victory, or is the story that the outcome of the race is still not known and votes are still being counted? So I think you have to ask your question of your, what the story is.
Absolutely, that story can differ definitely, and especially depending on the region. And getting into that localized context, what's the best source of truth for which states are starting to count mail ballots? Is it the National Conference on State Legislatures? And how do you anticipate that that will impact election night, that whole processing ahead of time, as far as election counts?
I like to think that the best source of information that is AP election research, and we can point you to that. Christina, how do you think the difference between when states can start processing and when they can start counting is going to play out on election night?
Honestly, I think the processing question is the bigger question rather than the counting, because many places, they have these, particularly in these large counties where there's lots of ballots, they have been purchasing high capacity scanners that will be able to, count in an inordinate number of ballots rather quickly. So I think from my standpoint, it's more about when they can begin processing them than when they can start counting them. Because in a lot of states, they can open up the ballot, they can flatten, the ballot, make sure it's not damaged, make sure the stub, if there's a stub, has been taken off. They can get them all stacked up. They can even put them in the machine, and then, once the time, the hour comes where they can start counting, they push a button and they start going through. So, there are some states that do allow for counting ahead of time. There's lots of oaths and secrecy associated with this. But as I said, I think the more crucial question in terms of potential delays in results is about when states can begin processing the ballots, because that's that whole validation verification process that just takes time. And when you have the amount of ballots that we're talking about, it's just going to take time.
I think it's a really counterintuitive point that Christina makes, that you would think when they can start counting is the more important piece of information, but it's actually that processing time that I think is the more important date.
And on that topic of mail ballots and some of that process, someone asked, Trump is using solicited and unsolicited as terms that are referring to mail voting. Can you talk about what he's trying to get at here? How do those things differ depending on the region and the state?
So essentially, he's seeking to draw a distinction between states like Colorado, Washington, Utah. It's not just Democratic states, Republican states do this as well, that have a system where ballots go out to all registered voters. But if you take that one step back, to register is to essentially request a ballot, right? I mean, you are basically saying, I want to vote. And so, this kind of attempt to sort of draw a distinction between, states that, send ballots to every registered voter, in the state versus, a system where you not only have to register, but you also have to request a ballot for that particular election, known as absentee voting. But essentially it's a difference without a distinction. And so I think the concern that the president is talking about here is that in states that are sending out, as he calls them, unsolicited ballots, that these would be ballots that would be, piling up outside of apartments. And, there's all these ballots that would be out there that, that it would sort of open the door to fraud. But again, I go back to the process and understanding how the process works and how the validation, the verification process works, that is designed to ensure that voter fraud, isn't rampant, that it isn't widespread, and that when it does occur, it is caught and it is prosecuted. And so, I think that, it's very important to understand how the process works, and all of the steps that are in place to validate, ballots as they come in and to identify fraud.
Great, thank you. And on that note about, well, that begs the question about the messaging coming from the president overall. So someone asked, how is the AP planning to cover live Twitter activity from the president that may be disinformation or may call into question the legitimacy of the process or incite worry? I am especially curious to see if there's going to be any more resources devoted to that on election night or following election night.
Yeah, good questions. So first off, John and Andrew, do you guys want to plug the later session that we have coming up on misinformation?
Yeah, 2 weeks from now, we're going to discuss this topic in depth with the AP. So please tune in to that. But I'll turn it over again to David so he can give us a quick run up to that.
Yeah, sure. So the first, I'll answer your second part of your question first, which is, or do we devote more resources to this on election night? We devote more resources on election night to everything. I mean, it's an amazing thing to work at the Associated Press on election night. It is my favorite thing about working here. There is not one person in the news department at the AP who is not involved in some way on election night. Sports writers are writing election roundups, and folks from our business side are helping out, making sure the teams are communicating well with each other. Everyone is involved, and that goes for the misinformation team as well. There's tons of people who are going to be working that night on that particular topic. And to be clear, it's not just the president's Twitter feed that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking broadly for any types of that type of misinformation, or we're looking everywhere for that. We're reporting broadly about that. On his Twitter feed in particular, I would say that we're going to do the same thing that we do day in and day out, which is make cool, calm, deliberative decisions about what we report, about what the president is saying, in whatever venue he says it.
Great, thank you so much. Again, everyone, Andrew dropped in the link to sign up for that event 2 weeks from now. And again, we're gonna cover this in depth. So I hope to see folks there. Back to a previous point you made, David, about the denominator, the number of people who voted. You talked about how easy it becomes to project once you know the denominator. How soon do you know that number? And when do you feel comfortable with that number?
I mean, in the final version of it, we won't know for weeks until states certify their election totals. The question that we always have on the decision desk is it goes back to, can the trailing candidate catch up, right? And so, we're doing a lot of reporting to try to understand the scope of all the ballots that are out there. How many military ballots, overseas ballots, how many provisionals, how many advance votes ballots have not yet been counted. And then you put that in the context of the race. If a candidate is up 20 points and they're winning in advance vote, they're winning in the same day vote, they're winning in every geographic part of the state, they're winning in the votes that were counted before polls closed, and they're winning in the votes that were counted after polls closed, then you feel pretty confident, right? And you can go ahead and call the race. In places where it's a closely contested race and you can't put your finger on what that denominator is because you don't have enough good information, you wait. And that's what we have to do. And because there's always if there's a potential out there for a trailing candidate to catch up, and even if that potential is based on a lack of information, then we have to wait before we can make a race call.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask Christina about a recent story that I saw concerning absentee ballot rejections, especially in battleground states. Can you talk a little bit about how those ballot rejections may potentially factor into the vote and what you guys are doing, and any lessons or any important takeaways that we should consider when reporting on that individually within our states and in our newsrooms?
Sure, thank you. So I think it also kind of goes back to one of the earlier questions that was asked about sort of how do you weigh sort of the need to cover, some of these pressure points with sort of potentially feeding into, some of the narratives. And I think that, at the end of the day, from our perspective, it's about voter education also, and making sure that voters understand how the voting process works and have the information, that they need to be able to, fill out these ballots the way that they need to be to try to avoid, these issues that can come up. So you mentioned, ballot rejections, in particular, and certainly, ballot rejections overall represent, a small, number of votes that are cast, in a presidential election. But, if the numbers are in a few very close states, in a battleground state, what was it, 10,000 was the vote difference in Wisconsin in 2016. And so what we need to do, from the ballot rejection standpoint is to keep a close eye on it. And there's also, some research that suggests that, particularly young and minority voters are disproportionately affected by ballot rejection. So to answer your question broadly, it's something that I'm paying very close attention to, looking at the absentee voter reports as they come in to look at, what are the problems that voters are running into. Because it could also be a sign, of some other, issues, whether it's ballot design, the envelope design. That's something that election officials, pay very close attention to, but sometimes, there can be issues with things like that. And so the signature issue as well. So it's one of those sort of small issues that can matter a lot depending on the circumstances. So that's why, it's something that we're paying close attention to.
Great, thanks, Christina. And as Andrew mentioned, there's still time for some more questions. We're about 8 minutes left in the event. I do have another question ready, unless someone wants to drop one in the chat. but we've covered a lot of uncertainty, some aspects of litigation, last minute legislation that are obviously could potentially impact voting processes, mail processes, absentee ballot processes. Are there other outstanding uncertainties that may affect the process of voting, or when, how, and which votes get counted? Other things to look out for in that arena?
Goodness, we're not getting into nightmare scenarios, are we? I mean, certainly, you know, for me, for the next 30 days, I'm paying attention to, you know, how the absentee ballot process is going. Are election officials able to keep up with the onslaught of requests? Are ballots being sent out in a timely manner? I'm going to be looking at, as we get closer, sort of the ramp up in requests. You know, are people really waiting until the last minute to request their absentee ballots? I'm going to be looking at ballot rejections. You know, these are all things. And then, you know, of course, you know, something that we really haven't talked extensively about, but it's the election security component of all of this, and whether or not, you know, we could see well-timed ransomware attacks, which is something that I wrote about a few months ago, that, you know, could directly or indirectly affect local election offices. You have situations where, you know, we have seen an incredible increase in the use of ransomware as an attack vector for state and local governments. And, you know, while a local election office, you know, may not be targeted, it could easily get caught up in it if they don't have, you know, appropriate guardrails in place that isolate, you know, their systems from the broader county network. And so, you know, that's sort of an unknown factor in all of this. It certainly could be used by, you know, a foreign government, but it could also be some cyber criminal looking to make money, and, you know, ends up snagging, you know, voter registration information in the meantime, or, you know, locking out election staff while they're trying to handle an onslaught of absentee ballots coming in and going out. So there's a lot to be paying attention to, for sure.
The one that I would add is one that Christina mentioned in her presentation, but doesn't get a lot of attention, which is COVID not necessarily affecting voters, but affecting poll workers, affecting election workers. You know, what if, you know, and we've seen that, or we thought about that a little bit earlier in the pandemic, about like having enough, you know, people to work at polling places, you know, but what if there's an outbreak at a county that's a really important county, and they don't have any of the people, the ability to come in and actually process the ballots? So, I mean, that's another one that's on my list of, like, you know, things that might pop up unexpectedly and impact us on election day and week.
Awesome. To try to end on a good note and on a silver lining, I'll selfishly ask one question I'm interested in. So how will this year shape the AP's future coverage of elections? Do you see any renewed interest in this kind of civic-minded public service journalism about elections carrying forward? Is that something you guys are interested in?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm interested in. You know, a question just popped into the chat about, do we plan about cover things that are going well? Let me just say that there have been some state primaries, particularly toward the end of the process, that did go very well. Massachusetts ran a really good state primary last month. I believe it was last month. We're still in September. Maybe it was this month. I don't know. They all start to run together. It was late in the process. Florida state primary was very well run. So, like, there are some states that have used this time this summer to get ready for the things that they might experience on election day, even this year. You know, John, is in terms of like how we think about the future. If you had told me at the start of this year that we would get to more than 50% advance vote this year, I would have been like, well, maybe. but we're going to. And I only think that that trend is continuing. And so, I mean, it's not just how we cover elections, but America is moving even this year at a very rapid pace, but I think inexorably to a system in which voting in advance is the standard, not the exception. And I don't think that that number, whatever it is this year, will go down. I don't think you're going to see states like go backward in terms of advance voting. That's my prediction, is that we are this transition year. We're only going to see states in the future make voting in advance more available, and that's going to change how we think about elections in the United States. I mean, Christina, what's the number of people who have already cast ballots? We had our, heading into last night's debate. I think several million had already, like close to 2 million had already cast ballots before the first debate. So I mean, it's a change that's taking place in our country, and that's where I think we're going to see coverage change and elections change moving forward.
And I would just add real quick, in terms of keeping the focus on voting. I mean, I've been working on voting issues since 2016, so I don't think that's going to change. I think, our elections, our democracy, is a very important, coverage area for us. And to the point about, the good stories, I think that, from my perspective, even the story that I wrote last weekend about the poorly marked ovals, I see that as, an opportunity for voters to re-emphasize to voters that, when you're filling out these ballots, you have to follow the instructions. You have to use the right color pen. You have to fill in the ovals. And so, that's the type of story that I see as being sort of a voter kind of education, component to all of this. And, as we go forward, I think, it's important to try to, strive to explain this process as much as we can to the public and make sure that they understand it, so that, if there are false claims or misinformation, they are armed with information about how the process works.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. It's about time to wrap up. I want to once again thank David, Christina, the AP, Craig Newmark, my fellow community manager, Andrew, who's been manning the chat. We're going to send out a recording of this session and a recap email to everyone who attended. Please join us the next couple of weeks, same time, same place, to talk polling and misinformation with the AP. You can sign up at that Eventbrite link. If you're not a part of the Trusted Elections Network and are interested in the resources and events we offer, please join us. We're happy to have you. We're going to keep talking about this through Election Day and past Election Day. But again, thanks so much, y'all, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.